Okay, I'm gonna go. Yep. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this month's Post-Brexit clinic here at Queen's. My name's David Phinnemore, and I'm chairing proceedings today. As is the norm with these events, what we're going to do is we're going to run through a number of issues with you, with some presentations, issues to do with the protocol and where we are with its implementation or non-implementation and some of the politics around it. We're in person and also online, so welcome to those of you who are online joining us today. As ever, there's plenty to consider, and Katy and Billy are here with me today to do that with you. We'll have the presentations and then we'll move into some Q&A at the end. For those of you online, if you can put the questions into the chat or the question function, we will hopefully get to those for you after the presentations. Okay, so what we want to do is do a number of things today. One, to review a little bit about where we are and what's been happening with and around the protocol since we had our last post-Brexit clinic back in mid-May. Number of developments there, which we'll pick up on. Second, we want to present to you the results of the polling on views of voters in Northern Ireland on the protocol. This is polling undertaken by Lucid Talk at the beginning of June, and we've looked at the results and compiled a report on that, which has been published today. So Katy's going to take you through some of the findings that we have in that report. And then thirdly, Billy's going to take a look at the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which, as you will be aware, the UK government has recently brought forward. And it's a bill which received its second reading in the Commons on Monday. And I think it's fair to say it has elicited a forceful response from the EU, and I think Billy's going to look at that as well for you. Okay, I'm going to kick off by just reflecting on a number of developments around the protocol. So what has been happening? Last 6 weeks, I think, have really been dominated by the question of whether and in what form the UK government would equip itself with the means to take unilateral action over the protocol. And we've now got, or now seen, the content of the bill, and we're now seeing that bill go through Parliament. Okay. The rationale behind the bill appears to be that the protocol is not working, at least not in the interests of the people of Northern Ireland, according to the UK government, and the EU is not engaging with what the UK sees as the way forward, which was its command paper back in July last year. Moreover, the protocol is also clearly an obstacle to the establishment of the executive here in Northern Ireland following the Assembly elections last month. Now, I think it's fair to say that we're still a long way from resolution to the outstanding issues that might bring about the re-establishment of an executive. Suffice to say that there continues to be considerable amount of concern, particularly within unionism, about what the protocol entails and what it means for Northern Ireland. Okay. There's also, I think, a fair amount of questioning around the need and the wisdom of the bill, and we see that partly reflected in the fact that 52 of the MLAs wrote to the Prime Minister questioning the bill. But equally, I think it's fair to say that the bill does have its supporters. Hence, it cleared the second reading in the Commons earlier this week. But also, I think we see evident support for it within unionism in Northern Ireland, because it would, if it came into force, remove a lot of those checks and controls on the movement of goods from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, and we would see the removal of this Irish Sea border. That's said, EU is certainly not impressed with it. As Billy will say later, it's brought about or introduced some new infringement proceedings. But also, I think we have to note on the EU side, there has been an attempt, at least, to update position papers it produced back in October last year on how it sees some of the issues that have been causing concern being addressed. Okay. Just as it's important to note what's been happening, I think it's also worth noting what's not been happening. And I think we're struck here by the fact that if you think back to where we were 6 months ago, we had these pictures of Maroš Šefčovič and Liz Truss spending time together at Chevening, walking around in what seemed to be a very convivial mood. there's very little evidence of that still today. Relations between the UK and the EU, which seemed to be going through a bit of a reset at the beginning of this year with Liz Truss taking over from David Frost, seem to have moved very much back into a period of, I think Maroš Šefčovič called it stalemate recently, that we've got, the mood has shifted, there's not real much progress happening in terms of UK-EU dialogue discussion around the protocol. Also worth noting, there's very little happening in terms of the institutional framework which is set up to manage the protocol. We've not had a meeting of the Joint Committee, and I'm not aware of one being scheduled. Equally, the Specialised Committee has not met since we last met here, nor is one scheduled. The Joint Consultative Working Group is carrying on its work. That seems to be moving into a sort of a routine of activity. But also, when we look at the institutional framework for managing the protocol, we've not got a North-South Ministerial Council up to feed into the work of the Specialised Committee. The North-South implementation bodies are there, the human rights and equality bodies are there doing work, but in the absence of the institutional structure really functioning, they don't really have opportunities to be feeding into the governance arrangements. Also, if we look back, say, 9 months ago, there was a reasonable amount of optimism around saying that new arrangements could be put in place to facilitate the voice of Northern Ireland being heard in the running of the protocol. So ideas around enhanced engagement with business representatives, with civil society, that hasn't necessarily been progressed. Indeed, some of the momentum which we saw back in the autumn of last year seems to have faded quite considerably. Moreover, we've not had any more evidence sessions involving the principals, co-chairs of the Joint Committee. Partly that's because of obviously the Assembly not meeting, but equally I think the enthusiasm for engaging by them has possibly been reduced. Okay. Consequence of all this is that the UK and the EU are not really meeting to the extent that we probably need them to be meeting to address many of the concerns which we see are still around the protocol. Okay. They're not in the room essentially because they are fundamentally divided over the way forward. I think if one looks at the position of the UK government as expressed by the Foreign Secretary, it's very much around the process of, or the need to change the protocol, that you need to revise the text of the protocol. You need to go back to what was agreed in the withdrawal agreement and make quite fundamental changes to it. The clear desire to renegotiate the text. On the other hand, the EU is very much of the position, okay, we have a framework here for managing difficulties around the protocol. We need to be using that framework and exploring ways in which there may be flexibilities around implementation of the protocol, building on what the European Commission put forward back in October last year. Consequence of this on the EU side is they are refusing to renegotiate the protocol. Okay, so there's a fundamental difference there between the UK and the EU in terms of their approach. So it seems to me to be one of the key challenges at the moment is how do you actually get the UK and the EU back around the table to consider ways forward for addressing the challenges which the protocol has thrown up. Okay, how do you get them into the room to resolve the issues? Given the politics around both sides' positions, it's difficult to see that happening soon, and it's not too clear what the way forward is to bring them back into the room. There seem to be few optimists around believing that the UK and the EU will begin talking very soon, and we may end up having to wait until after the summer until they do get back together. In the meantime, we've got the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, as Billy will talk about a little bit more. Key point here to make is that, okay, yes, it's got through its second reading, but that is just one of the very early stages in what looks likely to be a very long process. We've got estimates that this could take up to 12 months, possibly even longer, even though the Prime Minister has indicated that he thinks it could all be done by the end of this year. I think it's fair to say that the bill is set to have a very difficult passage, particularly when it gets to the Lords, given the concerns which exist around its legality, what it means for the UK, what it means for the protocol, and the UK's relationship with the EU. Important to note that when it gets to the Lords, the government does not have a majority in the Lords, Moreover, it does not control the timetable. Okay, so this process is likely to persist for quite some time. Meanwhile, we've still got ongoing issues with the protocol, ongoing concerns around its implementation or non-implementation, what it means for Northern Ireland, both economically and also politically. And I think it's fair to say that the polling that was recently done, on which we report today, continues to flag a good number of the concerns which exist. But to take you through that polling, I'm going to hand over now to Katy.
Thank you, David. That was a very smooth transition. So yes, you'll all be familiar now with the polling that we've been conducting as part of this post-Brexit governance project. And we've conducted the most recent one at the beginning of June. So this is with Lucid Talk. We get over 3,000 responses to the poll, and the weighted sample is just under 1,500. So this is weighted to be representative of Northern Ireland voting population. And all of these results are presented with a margin of error of 2.3% plus or minus. So you'll be familiar with these questions that we repeat in every poll. So the first one is to test people's opinion with respect to Brexit and the protocol. I presented them slightly differently this time, with the largest negatives above moving to the most positives. So basically what we see is a consistent pattern from previous polls. So people generally think that Brexit is a bad thing for Northern Ireland. People, by and large, think that they have a good understanding of the protocol. We've seen steadily over the course of these polls a view that particular arrangements in Northern Ireland are necessary. That was 2/3 in the last poll in February. Now it's up to 72% of people saying that they think that Northern Ireland does need specific arrangements coming out of Brexit. Particularly of interest is the question of whether people think the protocol is on balance a good thing. And this is now over 50% say that they do think the protocol is on balance a good thing for Northern Ireland. That's 53%. 55% saying that they think the protocol is appropriate for managing the Brexit impact on Northern Ireland. So this is quite a significant change from, say, this time last year, where the results were pretty much evenly matched. Then we ask around the impact that the protocol is having on Northern Ireland. So now we have a majority of people, and again, this is quite consistent with recent polls, a majority of people saying that the economic impact of the protocol is actually positive. So majority of people saying that its impact in that respect is positive. The flip side is the political impact. So you'll remember that in consistent polls before, it's concerns around political stability, around the impact of the protocol on British-Irish relations, UK-EU relations. Those were where the majority of people had negative views, and the same is true in this case as well. And then in terms of the impact that it has on protecting the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, you can see that opinion is quite divided on that, although there is just about a majority in that respect too. Similarly with its impact on North-South cooperation. Notably, there are negative views or undecideds around its impact on Northern Ireland's place in the UK internal market and on its place in the UK, its constitutional place in the United Kingdom as well. We also ask about trust in actors to manage the impact of the protocol on Northern Ireland. And the pattern has been remarkably consistent again through these polls. There has been a change from the last poll, so we've moved up from 4% to 5% of people trusting the British government in its handling of the protocol, managing Northern Ireland's interests with respect to the protocol. But you can see there quite how overwhelmingly the majority is for distrusting the British government when it comes to the protocol. We haven't seen much of a change in that respect. Also, there are low levels of trust in the Northern Ireland executive. Obviously, when we have asked this question too often, the executive hasn't been sitting. Wasn't in this case, but the views are very negative. On the respect to whether you trust the Irish government and the EU Commission, those patterns are quite consistent, and if you dig down into that, That's because, by and large, nationalists trust the Irish government and the EU Commission. Unionists don't. But you can see there's a sort of even split there, around 45% trusting the Irish government, 47% trusting the Commission. And then you can see the different views with respect to political parties as well. Strong levels of distrust in the DUP, 50% distrust in Sinn Féin. The most trusted parties being the Alliance Party, followed by the SDLP. Interestingly, we've seen this again through the consistent polls. A lot of people undecided about the Ulster Unionist Party. We thought they were waiting to make up their mind. They still haven't quite made up their mind. Perhaps that's reflecting some ambiguities in the UUP's position on the protocol. And last but not least, again, following a pattern we've seen in other polls, the people who are genuinely trusted by the majority with respect to managing Northern Ireland's interests are the Northern Ireland's business reps. And the trust in them has continued to grow over the course of the protocol. So in previous polls, we said, how will you vote? How will the protocol affect your vote in the election? And in those questions that we asked, around 20% said the protocol wouldn't be important in the way they cast their votes. Interestingly, in this poll, when we asked them, well, how important was it? 28%, the position of the candidate on the protocol wasn't important. 30% saying they only voted for candidates who were opposed to the protocol or wanted it scrapped. 37% would only vote for those who are in support of the protocol. 5% managed to vote for candidates who had opposing views of the protocol. But you can see there the protocol is an issue that very much was of consideration for people when they cast their votes. And then we have the democratic consent vote at the end of 2024. Again, this is a question we've asked consistently. How would you like your MLAs to vote? And we can see there has been a growing difference in this over the course of our polling. 52% saying they want full application of the protocol, including Articles 5 to 10, and 40% saying against the application of Articles 5 to 10. And you remember a year ago that was evenly split as well. So there is very slight change, but it is beyond the margin of error. Now, on the questions around concerns around the potential impact of the protocol, the full scope of it, so not just its experience now, but how people think it might have an impact, particularly when the grace periods come to an end, if and when. And in response to some of the qualitative comments we got in previous polls, people saying they have no concerns around the protocol and they weren't allowed to give that as an option, we put this as an option this time round. So we said, do you have any concerns around the full implementation of the protocol and the full impact of it? And 36% of people said no, they don't have any concerns. Even if the protocol was fully implemented, even its scope, they don't have any concerns. So that's really interesting to note. That's quite a large portion, probably more than we would have anticipated perhaps. 55% saying yes, they do have concerns. So these results are taken from that 55%. So do bear that in mind. This isn't from the whole sample, it's just from the 55%. When we asked them around the specific issues that may come into play when the protocol is fully implemented, you can see that the biggest concern is around customs declarations on parcels. So parcels from business to consumer in NI come from GB to NI. If there was a customs declaration required, as according to the strict interpretation of the protocol, it should be. This is of concern to more than 2/3 of people, of the 55% who have concerns. Of least concern is Northern Ireland aligning with EU standards. 20% of those who do have concerns said it doesn't bother them at all. Of relevance, of course, to what's happened this week and since the 13th of June, how the protocol might be fixed. We've asked similar questions in the past, mainly around Article 16. This question is around, would the UK government be justified? Bear in mind, this was before the protocol bill was announced, although there was a lot of rumours of it coming. Would the UK government be justified in taking unilateral action to suspend all or part of the protocol? 57% of respondents saying no, they wouldn't be justified in so doing. Then we said, well, if they did take unilateral action, would the EU be justified in taking retaliatory measures? We didn't give them details as to what they might be. 55% said the EU would be justified in taking retaliatory measures if the UK took unilateral action. A very clear result, and this is probably one of the largest majorities we've had for any of our questions, is around, would you prefer there to be a negotiated UK-EU agreement on these outstanding issues to unilateral action? Almost 3/4 saying yes, that's what they would prefer to see. Only 18% saying they would prefer to see unilateral action over UK-EU negotiated agreement. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Belly. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll start off by just warning our audience, especially the online audience, if you see me stretching and squinting towards the right, it's because I can't see my slides. No, it's fine. It's not because there's anything wrong with me, it's just me striving to look at the screen. Plus there's a few obstacles in the way as well. Oh, David's fixed the problem for me. There you go. Also, I'm very aware that most people who attend these clinics are not particularly interested in technical aspects of the protocol bill, but bear with me, there are some interesting issues to address here. So what I wanted to do is to give you a broad overview of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, to try and understand what it tries to achieve and how it goes about achieving those goals, and also some of the challenges it raises. And then I'll discuss very briefly the legal challenges that the European Commission filed against the UK in response to the bill. So as far as the bill is concerned, one of its main features is this concept that you may have heard of, this concept of excluded provisions. Right? So the bill lists a number of provisions included in the Northern Ireland Protocol, which it refers to as excluded provisions, and these are mostly provisions relating to the movement of goods. So the protocol provisions which require the UK to comply with EU customs and EU internal market rules on goods. The provisions in the protocol relating to state aid, to VAT, and also the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the European Union. And together, these provisions are absolutely central in ensuring that this trade regime that's been established for Northern Ireland, where you have this removal of the avoidance of a hard land border, works in practice. But what does it mean? What is the purpose of these excluded provisions, right? So the issue here is that if you have an excluded provision, then the bill gives the UK government the power to adopt domestic legislation which would replace those excluded provisions with something else, right? So essentially it gives the UK government the power to override these key areas of the protocol, okay? Now, one problem that the UK government identified when it was drafting this bill was that even if it adopted legislation which was incompatible with the protocol, that legislation would probably be useless because under the EU-UK withdrawal agreement, there is this provision which says that EU law under the protocol produces the same legal effect as the legal effect associated in the EU legal order. So for example, EU law under the protocol is covered by the principle of supremacy, which means that EU law always trumps over domestic law. So even if the UK government were to adopt a legislation which would be incompatible with the protocol, which clashed with the protocol, you would be faced with a situation where UK judges would have to disregard UK legislation in order to apply the protocol, because EU law under the protocol reigns supreme over domestic law. So this is one of the challenges that the protocol bill tries to address, and it says, well, actually, for the excluded provisions, EU law in the excluded provisions, they no longer produce legal effect associated with EU law. So they do not benefit from supremacy or the direct effect, which means that if this bill is enacted and the UK government does choose to use its power to adopt legislation which clashes with the protocol, if a case went before the UK judge, and the UK judge noticed that there's a conflict of laws between domestic law and the protocol, it would apply UK law rather than the protocol, okay? Now, so excluded provisions grant UK government the power to replace certain aspects of the protocol with a new regime. So what is this new regime? Now here, the protocol puts forward some broad general regulatory frameworks. And I use that deliberately because these aren't very detailed regulatory frameworks that would replace the protocol. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done in order for these substitute regimes to work in practice. So one of the ideas is to establish this green lane, red lane system, which is something that's been discussed for quite a while. And the idea here would be that goods entering Northern Ireland would access either through a green lane or a red lane, depending on the ultimate destination of those goods. So if a good is intended for the EU internal market, for example, it would go through the red lane, which would mean that it would be subject to EU regulatory compliance and EU customs checks. On the other hand, if you have a good that's entering Northern Ireland but is destined to stay in the Northern Ireland market, it would go through this green lane where it would avoid all these very cumbersome checks. Now, the way that works is that in order to benefit from this green lane treatment, you'd have to be part of a trusted trader scheme where you'd provide detailed information in terms of your business operation, your supply chains, to give the authorities some comfort that the goods that you bring into Northern Ireland will stay in Northern Ireland. And there would also be some sanctions associated with that. So if you're misrepresenting the ultimate destination of those goods, you'd face some sort of criminal sanctions. The other idea is this dual regulatory regime, right? So the idea of a dual regulatory regime is that if you're a business here in Northern Ireland and you're producing or manufacturing goods, you can choose to produce or manufacture those goods either in line with EU law or with UK law, right? So that's not the situation currently. Under the protocol, Northern Ireland, you're subject to EU law. With this option, you'd have the choice whether to subject your goods to UK law or EU law, okay? I'm not sure to what extent you've been following this debate, but it's something that's been heavily criticized by business here in Northern Ireland because they see this as creating an additional layer of complexity to already a fairly complex trading and regulatory regime. And it's also something that the EU is very unlikely to accept because obviously a system where you have goods in one jurisdiction that are subject to two separate regulatory regimes, that creates a huge risk that those goods will then be moved on to the EU. And in doing that, it would undermine the integrity of the internal market. Finally, the other thing the protocol makes clear is that this exclusive jurisdiction that the Court of Justice has on EU law matters related to the protocol will be gone. There might be a diminished role where all disputes relating to the protocol are brought before an arbitration panel, and then the panel will then have the option to refer questions of EU law to the Court of Justice. Okay. I've done something with your slide, yeah. So I think I've changed the pane. It doesn't matter. So as far as almost immediately after the UK announced its plans with respect to the protocol bill, the EU responded by saying it would initiate a number of legal challenges against the UK. These challenges all take the shape of infringement proceedings or enforcement actions. The two mean the same thing. Essentially, it's a judicial review mechanism under EU law where the European Commission can challenge the legality of actions adopted by EU member states, or in this case, the UK. So enforcement actions are typically subdivided into two components. First of all, you have the pre-litigation or pre-judicial stage, which is really intended to give the European Commission the opportunity to get a member state, or in this case the UK, to comply with its own volition. And it's only when that's not happening, or where the European Commission is not convinced that the UK is going to comply with EU law, that you initiate the second stage of the procedure, which is where you go before the Court of Justice and ask the court to declare the action of the UK to be illegal. And if that happens, then the UK is legally bound to act in compliance with the judgment, in compliance with EU law. And if it refuses to do that, then there's a final step, which is the European Commission can ask the court to impose financial sanctions on the UK. Now, in terms of what the EU has done in practice, first of all, it has reactivated the infringement proceedings, which it suspended last year, right? So if you cast your memories back to, well, it's over a year now, after the UK decided to unilaterally extend the grace periods, for example, the grace periods relating to SPS checks on agri-food imports, the European Commission launched an infringement proceeding against the EU, but it eventually decided to suspend those proceedings after the publication of the UK command paper, and the UK agreed to try and find some sort of negotiated solution. Obviously, that hasn't happened because, well, we are where we are right now. So it's decided to reactivate that enforcement action. As it stands, we're still in the pre-litigation stage of that proceeding. So the European Commission sent a reasoned opinion to the UK, and a reasoned opinion is basically just a document which provides detail in terms of what the alleged infringement is, what provisions of EU law are being infringed, and in some cases the European Commission will provide some detail in terms of the types of steps that the UK, or a member state, in this case the UK, could take in order to rectify the infringement. In this case, the European Commission has said that it's given the UK 2 months to reply, and if it doesn't reply within those 2 months, it reserves the right to start the second stage of the proceedings, so to take the UK to court. In addition to that, the European Commission announced that it would be initiating infringement proceedings and identified 2 additional infringements. The first one concerns the failure to carry out SPS checks and to provide adequate staffing at the border control points in Northern Ireland. And the second one concerns the failure to provide statistical data on trade. There was some discussion about the possibility of also starting proceedings in the context of the arbitration panel created by the EU-UK withdrawal agreement. In fact, again, if you cast your memories back to last year, the European Commission had initiated arbitration proceedings against the UK in response to the extension of these grace periods, arguing that this extension constituted a violation of the good faith requirement under the withdrawal agreement. It was assumed that that would also be reactivated, but that hasn't quite happened. So there's something to look out for. So I'm aware that I've been talking for quite a while. No, Esther? Okay. No? Well, that's all I have to say. Just to add on something that David mentioned when he was discussing the EU's response. So the EU also, in addition to these legal challenges, published some proposals in terms of how to address some of the challenges that businesses have faced in the implementation of the protocol. Again, if you cast your memories back to October of last year, it had issued a number of proposals. So I think there was 4 proposals overall. So one on customs, one on SPS, one on medicines, and the other one on stakeholder involvement. At this time, it's released 2, one focused on customs and one focused on SPS. And these proposals really highlight the different approaches or the different perspectives between the UK and the EU. So the EU's proposals are based on working within the parameters of the protocol and exploring potential flexibilities. So most of the proposals from the European Commission are based on the idea that it can amend its own domestic legislation to facilitate the ability of businesses in the UK and involved in Northern Ireland GB trade to continue doing trade and to remove some of those burdensome customs and regulatory compliance requirements to the extent possible. So what it's suggesting to do is to change its own legislation to take into account the specific needs of Northern Ireland businesses. But it's working within the parameters of the protocol rather than wanting to revisit and renegotiate the protocol. Whereas the UK's approach is that the protocol is the problem, and either we need to replace it with something else or we need to completely renegotiate it. And it's very difficult, especially now that the bill has been published, to see how you can, reconcile those 2 opposing views. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks very much, Billy. Thanks, Katy. I think plenty there that we can get further into, I think, if people have got questions. So yes, over to you in terms of people here with us today at Queen's, but also if there's anybody online who's got questions, please do send them through and we'll see if we can get hold of them. Okay. So, yes.
Hi. Can we use the mic for people at home? Just,
Yeah.
thanks.
Hi, George Bell. I just want to raise, I don't want to take away a whole lot of the efforts, but it seems to me that what we're moving into is like a sham fight, which is appropriate to the season that is coming up. Because as I read it, the European Union are talking about 3 pages, and the UK are talking about getting rid of 78 pages of documents which would go east-west. And the bill itself seems like an anticipatory breach, because until the bill is passed, no breach would have happened. So it seems to me like the dynamics of negotiation are going on, and the actual agreement isn't that far apart. But what is far apart is how you get to that agreement. And I think that's a bit like people being in a huff. Obviously, it's complex. So there is the potential of local politicians to come off the fence, because, to excuse my schoolboy Latin, they seem to be going into pacta sunt servanda, that the agreement must be kept. So you've almost got like local politicians not realising the potential for getting rid of some of the unnecessary paperwork, but still maintaining the protocol. So the protocol can be maintained, but what we might find is that one way of actually managing the protocol, even in the future, would be built in on the ad hoc experiences that the European Union and Liz Truss are having, by having maybe a protocol commission in Northern Ireland that could manage things down the track. And that might add some trust locally, that we have some control over it. So the actual protocol, which is the sticking point, could still remain with the agreement to minimise east-west, the Green Corridor, but at the same time give us some local say in it that would allow the businesses and the politicians to actually come to some managed agreement. Because even if we agree to protocol, there'll be a lot of lessons down the line that we need to anticipate that we could actually further manage, and that in itself would maybe help the relationships between North and South.
Okay. Katy, do you want to come in on that one?
Yes, I think you're right, George, in terms of there's a lot of dramatics here. Like, there's a lot of performance on both sides for their distinct audiences. So obviously the EU's response is with very much a mind to its member states and how fed up they are and how they thought the deal was done and dusted and they wouldn't have to think about Northern Ireland again back in October 2019. So that's who the EU's thinking of primarily, wanting to draw that line and not open things up again. And then, of course, the UK and the actions of the UK government are very much to a domestic audience and almost internally within the Conservative Party, I think is fair to say. And you're right to focus on, as David did, the question of, well, amid all of this, and it may be very dramatic, but it does have consequences. Where do we get to the point of actually getting to the genuine concerns that exist? And we do see those concerns reflected in the polling and in business, in what business has said. And I think there is a little bit of a worry that, as David says, there's unlikely to be much movement for the next couple of months. There'll be a lot of hot air around it, a lot said around it probably, but there won't be much movement. Now, does that mean that the uncertainty itself has an effect in negative impact on Northern Ireland? Or actually, could that potentially create a space for those talks that might go on between stakeholders in Northern Ireland and the UK and the EU? I mean, I think the hope would be to try and address those issues, that you would have the 3 lots around the table, the UK and EU could talk again, involving directly people with evidence from here, particularly business community, particular sectors most affected. That will take, we're a long way, I think, from that at the moment. And the ad hoc stuff is good, but ultimately, as you've heard us say many times before, the structured engagement is important because, you know, we're kind of familiar with this, right? We've been here many times before, many times thinking, well, what's going to happen next? Almost, it's, you know, the unpredictability is highly predictable. And yet ultimately, so far, there's always come back to some form of agreement. The question is, this is going to go on for a long time. How do we make sure that it doesn't go further and further away from the interest in NI, as we're seeing represented from business and in our polling? And this is why the structured engagement proposals from the EU and the UK's request for clearer governance arrangements and involvement is actually, I think, the most important thing to focus on longer term.
Anything you want to say, Billy?
No, I
think just to add to what Katie's saying there, I think one thing we need to spend more time thinking through is the actual governance arrangements. Okay, they were designed for a backstop, which is going to be, or supposed to be, temporary. When that shifted to being the front stop and the arrangements we have now, no real consideration was given to how those structures possibly needed to be adapted to address the potential semi-permanency of the arrangements. Okay. Moreover, I think a lot of the challenges we see around the protocol relate to the question of divergence. And I think we're still looking to see how that particular dynamic is going to be managed, whether that's in terms of divergence between what the EU does and the UK, or what the UK does, mindful of its obligations under the protocol. And so there needs to be discussion between the UK and the EU, but also within the UK, as to how these divergence issues are managed. And at the moment, there don't seem to be necessarily the structures there to manage that process. Okay, and I think part of what needs to be done is to really think through how those can be operated in a way which ensures that a voice for Northern Ireland is included, whether that's within the development of UK position or within the UK-EU relationship. Okay, all right. Got a couple of questions here online. From John Pete. Does the panel share the public view that most pragmatic easements of controls, trusted traders, red-green lanes, long grace periods can be fixed without changing the Northern Ireland Protocol? Why does the UK government disagree? I'll take the pressure off of Katie a bit. Billy, do you think it can be done?
Ask the lawyer.
Can you repeat the first part of the question?
So does the panel share?
I got stuck in the why does the UK government thing?
Does the panel share the public view that most pragmatic easements of controls, trusted traders, red-green lanes, long grace periods can be fixed without changing the protocol text? Why does the government disagree?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that can be done to improve the operation of the protocol. Some of those things I think have already occurred. Others could happen, but of course those discussions are not happening precisely because the two parties are talking in a completely different language, and what they want to achieve in negotiations is so far apart that it's very difficult to find some sort of middle ground. I think in terms of the red lane, green lane, as I was explaining before, this is not something new. This was something that was discussed. I believe I'm right in saying that this was discussed when the withdrawal agreement was being negotiated. This is an idea that was floated here in Northern Ireland. It was floated by the UK government when they were negotiating the protocol, and it was an idea which I believe was rejected by the European Commission that thought it was just too complex and there was too much danger that goods that are in Northern Ireland would be moved on to the EU internal market. So my opinion is that that's not something, it's not a model that's likely to be agreed by the European Union, although that's not to say that it's necessarily a bad idea. Maybe it's an idea that should have been further explored during those negotiations. That said, the problem we have here is that beyond the sphere of law, you have politics, and in order for any of these things to work, you need to have two parties who trust each other, right? And that's certainly the case with the red lane, green lane. You need to have two parties who trust each other, who trust that the relevant information will be shared. and that the system, the regime will be policed and enforced in the correct way. And if you have two parties who have absolutely no trust, which is the case right now, it's very difficult to see how they could come to any agreement in terms of a trade regime which has to be coordinated by two different jurisdictions.
The only thing I say in terms of trying to answer that question is why the UK government disagrees, and I think it's fundamentally because Northern Ireland de facto remains in the single market, and with that goes several things, including obviously the issue of state aid, and then the reach back into GB, and including the role of the Court of Justice, and I think that sits very uncomfortably in some quarters, and so as long as the protocol exists as it without fundamental revision, as long as Northern Ireland can be said to have de facto part of the single market, with the opportunities that brings, there are consequences of that which do put certain constraints on the capacity of the British government to act at some level. So I think that's possibly key.
I think just the one thing I'd add is that when we look back at the language of the EU for the last 6-9 months, it refers back to its October papers and talks about flexibilities and possibly exploring them. I think what we don't know is the extent to how much flexibility there is within that. When we look at the new papers, they're essentially a summary of what has been said at various points and is putting it into the public domain. But it doesn't necessarily contain the full extent of the possible flexibilities. But you're not going to find out what those flexibilities are unless you actually get in the room and discuss them. But we seem to have reached an impasse where actually crossing the threshold into that room to discuss flexibilities is one which the UK government is not willing to take.
I mean, if I just come in on that, I mean, what the new proposals do is that they provide more detail in terms of how those initial proposals could be achieved. So the European Commission goes into some detail in terms of explaining which laws it is prepared to amend in order to accommodate Northern Ireland in the context of the protocol. I think a key problem with that is that all of these proposals are subject to conditions, right? They come with strings attached. So if you want to have further easements, then the UK from its side has to make certain accommodations as well. And there is talk of potential, regulatory alignment in some areas, but mostly there's talk from the UK side, from the EU side, of the UK being, more active in terms of the enforcement of the rules, which hasn't been the case so far. And so I think part of the reason why we don't have the full detail is because we don't know how far the UK would be willing to go in satisfying those conditions.
Okay, couple more questions online. I'm going to come to Katy with these. One, does the panel think if the bill is passed and acted on, the result would have to be a customs border either north-south or between Ireland and the EU? And related, if a dual regulatory regime is adopted for Northern Ireland, is there any research to indicate which regime traders will prefer?
So, on the customs border question, I think the simplest thing to say is that the bill is framed in such a way to really prioritise moving goods from GB into NI. So it's thinking very much about easing the passage for British goods entering Northern Ireland. And it's not thinking about north-south. It's kind of presuming there'd be continuity in that regard, and that the EU would continue to allow the part of Article 5, which effectively keeps Northern Ireland in the customs union of the EU. So, and it means that Northern Ireland businesses don't have to have customs declarations to move goods into the European Union. So that's still there, but the effect of it, whether the EU would be willing to sort of recognise that part of Article 5 if you have effectively no customs checks or very few customs checks on goods coming into Northern Ireland from outside of the EU, then that's another question. So it would be a very real concern, I think, and one that the EU would be very alert to. But on the basis of experience, I'm not going to go several months ahead and talk about, a potential hard border. But in principle, you always come back to that question: where is that border going to be? Where are those checks and controls going to take place, and what category do Northern Ireland goods fall under? I don't think that's clearly addressed in this bill. There's a big question mark over that. The UK government would like it to be Northern Ireland to genuinely have the best of both worlds, but ultimately there has to be some decision made. And then on the dual regulatory regime, I'm not aware of any research that says what businesses would prefer, but it is the case that so for exporters, so fundamentally there's a sense of, first and foremost, wanting to be absolutely clear. So the less confusion there is, the better for business. And I think one thing obviously to note is that we don't necessarily know what the future UK regulatory regime will look like, how much it will diverge from the EU and where it will diverge, although we do know that there are plans obviously to move away from EU regulations, particularly in sensitive areas such as agri-food, such as gene editing. And that would definitely have an effect on Northern Ireland agri-food products entering the single market, etc., and some risk with that respect. So maybe I'm not aware of many saying they'd want to continue on with the preferring UK standards, because we literally don't know what those are going to be longer term. We do know the concerns around what might happen if the two diverge, and if there is a big question mark over what standards Northern Ireland goods are meeting.
Just to follow up on that, I think we don't really need to carry out a study in terms of which, regulatory standards most businesses would want to align themselves with, because it makes sense, at least to me, that if you're a Northern Ireland business and you know that if you manufacture or produce your goods in line with EU standards, you have unrestricted access to the EU internal market, but also you have unrestricted access to the UK market, because under the UK Internal Market Act, goods that are made in Northern Ireland benefit from the principle of mutual recognition. So despite the fact that there may be regulatory divergence with the rest of the UK, Northern Irish goods have access to the GB market. So from a business perspective, it makes sense to just go with the simplest solution, the one that gives you access to two big markets. I suppose, and this has been pointed out by other observers, the issue really with the dual regulatory regime is it concerns GB businesses who export to Northern Ireland, and whether they're just going to decide to comply with UK standards, and therefore there will be a problem for Northern Ireland businesses that use GB inputs into their products, and how that affects their ability to then export those products to, for example, the Republic of Ireland. Yeah. How significant that is, I don't know. That's maybe the area where you'd have to carry out some sort of analysis.
Okay. Are we aware of any other countries where a dual regulatory regime operates?
Should have told me that before we came here. No, but I'm not aware of. There are a number of international agreements that create hybrid trade and regulatory regimes. I'm aware of some in Asia, for example, with Hong Kong and I think Macau as well. But I wouldn't be able to go into detail on that. Yeah.
Okay. Another. Sorry, question here. Yeah.
Sorry. I was just going to ask about the enforcement action. Who would actually be doing the enforcement? And is there some sort of higher level at which people can take their disputes? And would that be invoked ultimately, like the World Trade Organization? So I guess I'm asking, what would enforcement action actually mean?
So would that be enforcement of the protocol, or are you talking enforcement in terms of the dispute between the EU and the UK?
I'm thinking about enforcement of these disputes between the EU and the UK. If the EU decided it wanted to enforce, say, well, any of these things, how does that actually operate?
All right, and so that would be in the context, for example, when I talked about the enforcement action, you take taking the UK to court, and then there'll be a financial sanction, and then the UK decides not to pay. Is that what you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Those actions would be taken as
Right.
Those actions would be taken as financial sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So the way that certainly wouldn't be an area for the WTO law. It's two completely different issues. So if the Court of Justice were to impose a financial sanction on the UK and the UK doesn't pay up, well, you can't do much about that. But you might wish to respond to that by using certain mechanism in the trade and cooperation agreement, by, for example, suspending certain market access concessions, by essentially increasing tariffs on the UK in order to force its hand.
Another question from online. We've also got a situation at the moment where the executive has not been established following the last election, and there are questions as to whether there will be one established. Question that's coming through is, what are the prospects for new elections, or indeed direct rule, should the Assembly not be formed? Katy.
So in theory, at the end of October, early November, the Secretary of State should make a decision, if there's no executive form by then, to hold a new election within 12 weeks. So we'd be looking at an election early spring next year. It looks doubtful that there will be an executive form by then. So if you take things as read, then we could expect another election, I guess, early next year. However, we know that that's not, there are ways around it, perhaps. I think a lot depends on really what happens with the bill. If it looks as though this is becoming likely to be passed, and in what form it might be enacted, and then how the DUP, because obviously the DUP are absolutely critical here, how they are responding to that. We know that there have been some moves to try and encourage the DUP, at least to nominate a speaker in response to the protocol bill, and the UK government is saying that it wants the DUP to get to move back in. So far, it's not doing that. Maybe things will change as the months go on. I don't see the prospects for direct rule being on the table at the moment. Not least because of the provision for caretaker executive and everything. So I think the more likely thing than going to direct rule would be to get around somehow of having another election. We do know, acknowledge that the DUP's actions are supported, according to Lucid Talk poll and the Belfast Telegraph, are supported by the majority of their supporters, and by TV supporters. So in some quarters, the DUP may think that they would have better prospects in another election. However, they are not, of course, the majority party, and the majority of people think differently. Whatever it would be, if we were to have another election, we could probably be quite, we could anticipate that the protocol would very much be at the heart of it, but also fundamentally around the future of the Good Friday Agreement institutions themselves and their long-term sustainability.
Okay, thanks, Katy. Okay, I don't see any more questions either online or in the room today. So I think what we'll do is we'll draw things to a close. Sorry, we've got one last question.
Sorry to be a bore, but I'm just wondering if anybody has started thinking about technology again, because we're 2 years past COVID and we've had massive jumps into things like Zoom. So one would guess that when even Theresa May was talking about this, people were talking about technology and dismissing it. But what I'm trying to think is, has anybody started the conversation that technology could reduce the amount of paperwork and the trusted status that would be needed through technology? I haven't seen anything at all there, but one would guess that the people that have the technology would be trying to sell this as a possible solution. And I just wondered, has anybody heard anything, or can we just say that nobody's actually raising technology at this point in time?
Okay. Katy, one for you.
Well, very simply, if there was the technology there to have a smooth, invisible, frictionless border, it would be being applied on the Irish Sea. And fundamentally, you come back to the question of the basis upon which technology works is data. And that's the big question and concern in many ways around what the Irish Sea border is. It's not necessarily around the procedures followed, but it's about the amount of information that you need to give for the customs declaration or for certification, etc. That's the burden. People complain around the paperwork burden. That's what it is. It's about giving that information and needing that information for then it to be used by technology. So the British government at the moment, in its solutions, it had a solutions paper that went alongside the protocol bill. It wasn't stressing technological solutions. It's big. It's sort of would like to get more ideas on that, I think, because fundamentally you can't get around. You can't avoid the need to know what is crossing the border and where it's intended to be, etc., etc. And that's particularly so when it comes to regulation. So, I don't see that. I think we'll hear more about it, but it's certainly not being one that's being suggested as a solution for the whole thing.
Okay, we've got one further question just coming.
Hello, Phil Graham. I just want to add to the IT question, is it legally must be understood that 1/3 of any community, it is not disabled friendly or age friendly. And so therefore those aspects need to be addressed, border or otherwise, before we go forward, because I'm visually impaired and I can't use it. I've been to Queen's, and the IT staff at Queen's or whatever college, sensory impaired is not in their training. So we need to overcome those issues first.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good point, and there's a lot of it's a whole big issue around bias and a lack of consideration for diversity, etc., in the use of technology and in the design of technology. So you're absolutely right to note that. But even fundamentally in the question of using technology to manage customs and regulatory borders, you can't get around the fundamental question of what you need to make that technology work, which is around information. So that's a good point.
Okay, can't see any other questions. So can I just thank everybody for coming along today, whether in person or online. We're going to be continuing to monitor what's happening with the protocol. We'll see. There's going to be stuff happening with the protocol bill, no doubt, over the coming weeks. We may see some movement between the UK and the EU. We'll have to see. We're going to be probably scheduling another post-Brexit clinic sometime in the autumn. We'll be running our next poll in early October to see what opinion is then, and we'll be obviously reporting back on that. But just to sort of reiterate my thanks to everybody for coming along today, and yeah, hope you found that informative and useful. If you're interested in the report on the public opinion, we will get that posted, that communicated to you, the link for that. And yes, thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.